Ladies and gentlemen, I formally welcome you all with a very, very good evening. My dear friends, today I would like to engage you in a very, very important dimension, and that is relating to the protection of human rights in the context of Africa continent. We have already deliberated international dimensions, international pillars which have been designed exclusively for the protection of human rights. I have deliberately chosen African system of human rights or African human rights system to understand the entire protection system from the below or from the global south perspective. My dear friends, to understand African human rights system, there are certain important questions. And these questions, I am not at all confining the questions which I am going to share with you. These questions are the only questions. That is not my intention. Rather, many other important questions are there, and you may also design, draft, and delineate some of the dimensions in the form of questions to understand what exactly is there in the context of Africa continent with regard to the protection of human rights. The question that comes to my mind is, what was the impetus for the establishment of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights? What were the factors which are responsible? What are the factors which have been designed and developed and ultimately guided the human wisdom to calibrate certain important questions? What makes the Charter, I mean the African Charter on Human Rights, unique from the other international instruments designed to protect the human rights of individuals, groups, collectivities, indigenous people, and other important particular sections of the people? How does the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights fulfill its mandate in promoting, protecting, fostering human rights in this part of the world? In what ways is the African Code of Justice and Human Rights being challenged? What are the new challenges which are present and which are there before the African Court of Human Rights? What exactly are the, discernible differences between international system of human rights at one side? On the other side, how does it differ from regional arrangements for the protection of human rights in the context of Africa? These are some of the important deliberations, my dear friends, with which we should try to understand our entire what we call engagement in this particular arena. My dear friends, in every continent, whatever the continents are there, whatever the regions are there, whatever the subcontinent priorities are there, in each and every continent there is a collective concern. In the context of Africa continent, my dear friends, I perceive, this is my well considered individual understanding, And you have every right to disagree with me. Or rather, I would like to enlighten myself with your wisdom, how we are going to understand this uniqueness, novelty, innovation in the context of identification of collective concerns of African people with regard to the protection of human rights. In the context of European Union or in the context of entire Europe, I find that the primacy of the civil and political rights, or in other words, let me put it like this, that it is the idea of individualism that is important in the context of human rights in European context or in American context or in Pax Americana context. Therefore, in a South Asian context, I find there are two important basic concerns. Collective rights, or in the context of entire what we call South Asia, we can also say that in this particular area of understanding, that it is the rights of minorities in South Asia that has become some kind of a predominant concern for the protection of human rights. In the context of Africa, my dear friends, as per my understanding, what I have identified on the basis of my prolonged engagement as a student of international human rights law, I find culture. Culture is the most important concern in the area of Africa continent, or in particular in the context of the protection of human rights. My dear friends, there is an ongoing debate among scholars over whether or not the concept of human rights is entirely Western. So people are asking questions. Questions that have been raised include the many other important questions in addition to the questions what I have already submitted. The basic and the most fundamental question that must also be attended, and that is, can we really expect non-Western people to embrace international human rights instruments, which are by and large Western in character? What is that, Western orientation of human rights that must also be deciphered, and to what extent that Western orientation of human rights has been welcomed in Africa continent? If non-Western cultures, my dear friends, do not encapsulate or do not possess the Western conception of human rights, do they have other approaches to the enhancement of human dignity? Then what is the secondary thought in this particular context? If human rights are not available, then how to enhance human dignity, and that too in the context of what we call of the global South, or in other words, let me say, in Afro-Asian jurisdictions? How to enhance this whole idea of human dignity? Is there any kind of a possibility, my dear friends, to contemplate that in the absence of human rights, these are the various alternatives, options, these are the alternative logistical approaches which can be employed for the enhancement of human dignity in Africa or in marginalized or deprived societies? Or do we think, or should I try to contemplate that the human rights remains the only viable option for the protection and for the enhancement of human dignity within a given situation or in a given geopolitical entity? My dear friends, it is perhaps in the nature of such a discussion that these questions, the questions which I have put forward for your consideration, for your perusal, will never be satisfactorily answered. There seems to be some kind of a consensus. However, that the concept of human rights is generally understood is historically a Western concept. It is generally attributed. But on a personal note, on a personal footing, my dear friends, I do not contemplate in my personal capacity that the concept of human rights must exclusively be attributed to the Western orientation or to the Occidental jurisdiction's creativity. That is not the case. Human rights is a concept, my dear friends, which has always been present in each and every geopolitical entity. Its thrust area, its orientation may differ from each other. As I have already submitted at the very outset of my submissions, that we identify, or in my personal capacity, you may have a different kind of a technique for identifying, acknowledging, recognizing what exactly should be the core value in the context of in the context of Africa, so far the protection of human rights is concerned. To me, it is culture, cultural rights. Because when we are talking of culture, my dear friends, we are basically talking of collectivity. We are talking in the context of community. We are talking in terms of indigenous people. We are talking in terms of the group rights. It means we are talking of the idea of collectivization of individualism. So that is why I am of the view, when we are talking of culture in the entire human rights discourse, in the entire human rights deliberations, it is basically the culture that has become central to the entire gyration, entire surrounding of human rights. So this is how we should try to visit this entire understanding of human rights, and how these human rights are going to be protected in the context of Africa. So people are there are many important scholars who have been attributing that the concept of human rights from all kinds of understandings that ultimately remains Western, and that really makes me uncomfortable. It has become problematic because everything should not be attributed to the Western creativity. We the people on this side of the globe, I am talking of Afro-Asian nation states and the scholarship which is present there. We should try to understand the whole idea of human rights from below, and that is why I have deliberately chosen, my dear friends, African orientation of human rights. When we are talking of Africa, you will find a lot of similarities. What is there in Asia, what is there in Latin America, and what is there as a whole in the global South nation states. So therefore, we should try to understand the more troubling questions facing Westerners and non-Westerners alike, particularly that is relating to whether the contemporary international human rights instruments, given their Western biases, can be said to apply to the peoples from the non-Western cultures. So that should be taken into consideration, because despite an increase in the discussion of human rights in Africa, my dear friends, very little exists in the form of literature that approaches the idea of human rights from different kinds of approaches, from different kinds of angles, from different kinds of perspectives, and particularly in this context, it is the African perspective that must be taken into consideration. What most Africans, my dear friends, have written on the subject of human rights, it tends to be either attempts to show that the Western concept exists in African cultures, or Western style condemnations of the abuse of human rights in Africa. But this is not the situation in reality, because this is not the responsibility, my dear friends, of the Western jurisdictions, of the Western scholarship, to civilize or to sensitize the African people or Afro-Asian nation states about the sensibility, and the significance of human rights. We are having our own orientation of human rights. That is why it is our fundamental responsibility to look back, to understand This is our idea of human rights. And this idea of human rights must also be what we call embedded in our psyche. So therefore, my dear friends, Western, particularly the Western, I am deliberately using this word, Western Africanist, I should say, scholars have made quite a contribution to the literature on Africa. These contributions, my dear friends, have usually been of the second type, that is condemnations of African regimes or African people for violating the basic human rights of the segments of the African population. While the increase in the discussion on human rights in Africa is both what we call timely and refreshing, but if you take into account, my dear friend, a survey of the literature leaves no one with the impression that scholars proceed on the assumptions that although traditional concepts on the enhancement of the human dignity are present in African culture, African societies have become modernized to a point where a deliberation of these traditional concepts has become esoteric, or indeed a pretext by Africans to avoid the hard questions about human rights violations to which the Western world accepts certain important, cohesive, cogent, and convincing responses. So how to what we call respond in this kind of a situation? That is $1 million question. So, or in other words, my dear friends, we can say Africans have not attempted in any real sense to articulate for the international human rights community in African sense, particularly African sense regarding the human dignity or perhaps human rights, one that flows from the African perspective on the self, and one that perhaps the rest of the international community can also what we call use or maybe privy to the utilizations of this kind of understanding. It is the aim, my dear friends, of, or it should be the aim of our understanding. Understanding how to what we call perceive human rights in Africa continent. Because non-African scholars, non-African expertise, non-African advocates of human rights who are there within the socket of a cross-cultural path, they must try to understand the idea of the natural rights origins of the Western notions of human rights. If we have to examine, then what kind of ultimate result should be there of these kinds of concepts, which primarily, my dear friends, denies culture in a very, very fundamental sense of our understanding. When I'm saying that I have identified the entire umbrella of human rights, entire broadly of human rights basically gyrates around one particular notion, and that is the notion of culture. It is the centrality. It has become, or it has acquired some kind of a pivotal position in entire schematization of human rights in the context of Africa. It is basically the idea of culture. Culture must be taken some kind of a taken to some kind of a exalted position if we have to appreciate it is the culture. And it is not only relevant in the context of Africa, my dear friends, it is equally relevant in the context of what we call of South Asia. The people of Pakistani Punjab see the importance of culture. The people of Pakistani Punjab, they are comfortable with the people of Indian Punjab and Indian Haryana provinces. The people of Bangladesh are comfortable people with that of Indian Bengal. The people of Afghanistan are comfortable with the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa people in Pakistan because of the cultural affinity. So culture is very important, my dear friends. Two sections of people living in Saudi Arabia from Kerala and Uttar Pradesh, these are the two provinces from India, they would be comfortable with the people. I mean, a Keralite would be comfortable with a Carolite in United States of America instead of his, if you measure the comfort, what he call, threshold with a person who is hailing from Uttar Pradesh. That is the importance of culture. Basically, even culture supersedes religion. Religion has become secondary when there is a question of cultural affinity. So therefore, I am of the view, this is my own personal understanding on these lines, that it is basically the primacy of culture that constitutes and that has become central to the human engagement and cross-fertilizations of ideas. Therefore, if you take into account this kind of analysis, then this analysis, my dear friends, might demonstrate that we should talk about rights within a cultural context, number one. Number two, Africa-centric conceptions of human dignity, my dear friend, is presumed as a valid worldview which should inform the cross-cultural fertilizations of ideas. The impact of Western ethnocentrism, my dear friends, and the disregard for the non-Western philosophical choices in international affairs have to be what you call, understood. And we are bound to achieve, we are bound to, conclude African communitarianism, my dear friends, has ingredients that should aid the formulation of the cross-cultural human rights norms. The contention is that, my dear friends, that the Western, what you call, understandings, or the Westerners may indeed have a lot to learn from Africans in this particular, context. Because on some other occasions also I have submitted for your consideration that in the Western scheme of understanding with regard to rights, with regard to the idea of human dignity as a fundamental right or the fundamental right, then we cannot just simply minimize. We cannot make this particular dimension extinct from the idea of the right to life. The right to life, my dear friends, in any geopolitical entity, in any kind of a epistemological orientation, any kind of a philosophical understanding, we cannot make this idea of human dignity out of right to life. Because right to life without human dignity, or right to life without right to dignity, is nothing but merely an animal existence. It is basically the dignity, my dear friends, that keeps our right to life alive and kicking. It is the right to dignity that attributes and that bestows upon vibrancy, lubrication, acceptability, accessibility, and affordability, transportability, conformity to the idea or grand vision of right to life. So without human dignity, my dear friends, we cannot survive. It is primarily the question of human dignity. We have to, and this is because of dignity. And I am taking a very, very huge circumference so far the right to life is concerned with human dignity. When we are saying that the right to life includes right to livelihood, I do not agree with this premise. My understanding is different, my dear friends. It is not the question of right to life or right to life includes right to livelihood. No, it is the right to human dignity that includes the right to livelihood. Because without right to livelihood, my dear friends, or without the right to eke out and dignified existence in the humanity or in the scheme of what we call of humanity on this beautiful planet, we cannot sustain right to life. And when we are, talking of human dignity, my dear friends, it encapsulates individual, what we call, concerns, as well as the collective concerns of human existence on this beautiful planet. So dignity becomes a larger picture. It is the beauty of this kind of a right, my dear friends, that must be appreciated and that must also be celebrated. Without which we cannot sustain the whole idea of this particular, what we call, understanding. Therefore, I do not, to a very limited extent, I do not, what we call, agree with this contention that there is a, domination of the Anglo-American ethical theory in the context of, Africa, or in other words, we may call it that ethical individualism is present in the orientation of human rights in Africa. It is basically nothing but the, what we call, a Western, what we call, civilizing mission. They generally, what we call, tend to, what we call, preach in the name of civilization, in the name of ethics, in the name of individualism, in the name of liberalism, in the name of republicanism, in the name of democracy. Because the Western orientation of these fundamental principles of, constitutionalism, as per their orientation, cannot be what they call a prescription for African people or in the context of, Africa. Therefore, ethical individualism, my dear friends, is able to draw a distinction between natural duties not to harm others and minimally altruistic acts and so-called some kind of a, what we call, superior, what we call, acts of the benevolence and the mercy of what we call of Western orientation of human rights. My dear friends, in the context of, Africa, human rights ideas in international fora have historically been derived from this very perspective, what has been, offered by the Western scholars. Western natural rights perspective, my dear friends, denies the existence of the, needy's right to economic sustenance and society's, obligations to satisfy or to fulfill or to accomplish this particular, right. African sense of community should be the, guiding force. Because it is the African sense of community obligation that goes beyond what we call, charity. Is just what is needed to foster economic rights and push the idea of economic rights beyond the demands of human rights activists and human rights, what we call, textuality. In this particular context, there is a need, and we need to have such non-Western, conceptions very, very seriously. Because Western social scientists are increasingly questioning, my dear friends, the sanctity of the liberal individualist paradigm that is generally advocated by the Western scholars. And this is a paradigm, my dear friends, which has been designed by the Western scholarship to rummage, to cajole, and try to what we call, quench the human rights orientation thrust. I can give you an example. The example is, suppose some scholars have started to question the effect of individualism on important social institutions such as marriage, and on the importance, what we call, or important societal functions of the child care, or the respect and the care of the elderly people in the society. In this particular context, when non-Western societies may have a lot to offer the West. Even more pressing, my dear friends, is the fact with increasing immigration from the third world to the Western world. And the Western world, my dear friends, if you take into account the political system of the Western, what we call, orientations, cannot in good conscience expect that non-Western peoples will always simply shed their traditional, what we call, worldviews and take on the, predominant worldview. Because if we are immigrating from India to Western Euro societies, if people from Afghanistan are taking shelter in Germany, if people from what we call Pakistan is landing in Saudi Arabia, or people from Africa are immigrating to United States of America, then in these what we call, contexts, they are also carrying their cultures with them. There would always be some kind of a, collective life. Collective life in Western, societies, or individualized, what we call, societies, or highly industrialized, societies. So that, political understanding must also be taken care of when we are going to appreciate the African idea of what we call of understanding. Even more pressing is the fact, my dear friends, with increasing immigration from the third world to the Western world, it becomes our, responsibility, because in many cases, the social legislation, we will have to take into consideration, into account, the worldview of immigrants with respect to what we call important institutionalizations. Therefore, it is the fundamental responsibility, my dear friends, of our part of the world, and we should try to understand the idea of the Western liberalism and how to contextualize it in the context of African understandings and African orientation of human rights. Dear friends, to critically appreciate liberal political philosophy, it is incumbent upon us to understand the medieval Western conceptions of society that preceded the liberal orientation of human rights, or liberal age of human existence. In medieval political thought, you might have studied, my dear friends, that the individual was seen basically in terms of his complementarity with other individuals. That is, as a integral part of human society. Because all associations were considered to be microcosmic, I should say, so far their visage and forms of a divinely instituted harmony was concerned. Every individual, my dear friends, therefore, made a contribution to the organization or community or group to which he belonged, and society functioned based on these contributions, considerations, and foundations. Equality, my dear friends, in those days was not required anymore than the working of the human body or of the universe itself requires equality on its parts. That was the naturalization of human existence, or the naturality of human existence. In a sense, the idea of an undivided or individual, what we call identity, or a liberal, what we call identity, separate from society, did not imply a notion of opposition between the parts and the whole. It means the collectivity of human rights was also acknowledged during those days. It was basically in the subsequent years the individualism has been what we call emerged at the surface. Therefore, the political philosophy of liberalism was largely a reaction to this medievalist, what we call, understanding. It was a, philosophical opposition, my dear friends, to traditional authority that was based on divine wisdom, religion, and the common law. The roots of the Western concept, therefore, we can say of human rights lie in liberalism. So, liberal understanding, but liberalism does not mean economic liberalism. Liberalism here was not meant to have some kind of a concentration of wealth. The original idea of liberalism, my dear friends, witnessed a direct connection between rights and human nature. That was the basic and most fundamental understanding when there was a question of having some kind of understanding of human rights, and how this Western orientation of human rights has influenced the idea of human right that was breathing up, that was popping out in the Africa context or African context. So with this understanding, my dear friends, we should try to understand what exactly is the notion of African understanding of human rights. Therefore, my dear friends, we can say there are as many as 55 nation states in the Africa continent. And the number of internationally recognized states in Africa are generally 55, though recently even the Morocco was also included. Another important dimension is 56, the number of internationally recognized states and de facto states, if we include Somaliland, then there are 56 nation states. But in terms of what we call of the ratification of the African Charter on Peoples and Human Rights, states which have signed and ratified are merely or are only 54, including the South Sudan, which ratified African what we call charter in the year 2013. So that is, so far the institutional framework is concerned, that is the situation. Now the question, a larger question that comes to our understanding collectively, with these what we call, I have provided enough intellectual what we call further intellectual agitation to understand that these are going to be our understanding regarding the African what we call notions of human rights. Then let us try to identify, my dear friends, what exactly are the human rights challenges, issues, and concerns in Africa continent. How to identify, number one, and what are those what we call issues in Africa. Anybody? Yes, Mr. Maharajan, would you like to say something?
Sir, he is in washroom right now.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah. You,
Anybody can respond. Well, in Africa in general, human rights are reported to be very, very poor, very awful. And it is, my dear friend, a grave concern to the United Nations organization as well. And there are certain important factors which are responsible for this kind of a sorry state of or sordid state of affairs regarding human rights in Africa continent. The very first factor that comes to my mind is it is the political instability. If I am correct, you can correct me if I am not wrong. Political instability, my dear friends, has created a lot of complications, implications, ramifications, and far-reaching repercussions. Another important point which really agitates me, and that is only 13 out of 53 countries are considered having a true democratic government. In other words, we can say that there is a situation in Africa continent that Africa continent has been suffering from the democratic institutionalization deficit. And this deficit must be what we call attended immediately. Because I am not talking of what kind of a democracy should be there, but I am of the view that the democratic deficit can only be bridged and attended to by an African orientation of a democracy. Because everywhere what we have been witnessing, there happens to be some kind of a Western imposition on Western orientation of democracy and democratization of institutions. That should be avoided. Because the democratization exercises oriented, invented, created in the Western scholarship has primarily bypassed the local conditions and the local requirements of a geopolitical entity. And that has created some kind of a disgruntled situation among the larger what we call masses. So if we have to take into account the massive reality in these kinds of situations, then it is important that we must try to address, because the democracy as an instrument of social inclusion should be the priority of these kinds of geopolitical entities. In many important South or global South societies, what we have been witnessing, my dear friends, that the democracy as an instrument of what we call of social change has become an instrument of exclusion so far the global South geopolitical entities and the future of democracy is concerned. So we should avoid these kinds of approaches. Under all circumstances, the democracy as an instrument of social integration can only be successful if it includes the marginalized sections of the society. Because when we are talking of democracy, we are talking of transparency, we are talking of participation, we are talking of ratification, we are talking of feedback. And that is the beauty of the democratic governance. Another important issue that troubles me is large areas of desert, rainforest, uninhabited land that is not easily patrolled by military or police, what we call, or law enforcement agencies of many geopolitical entities. It means the proper agricultural infrastructure has not been installed. That is another important issue, and that must also be taken care of. Because when we are going to attend large, desert, rainforest, barren land, and making them, cultivable, making these what we call large chunks of lands, converting them into arability or arable lands from agriculture point of view. And we are going to have equitable distribution of land holdings among the general masses, then it is basically going to, foster the idea of human dignity in Africa continent. So these are some of the important, issues in terms of what we call of, political understandings and agricultural understanding. I can give you, suppose, another important example we can take from a country like Uganda. We find invisible children in Uganda. Children are regularly abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army and forced to fight in a bloody civil war between the LRA and the Ugandan People's Defense Forces, which is popularly known as the UPDF, that has been what we call, raging since the 80s. My dear friends, it is generally from non-official, sources, or from informal, what we call, sources of information. It is generally estimated that some 10,000 plus children have been forced to, fight in Uganda, often placed at the front lines of the individual battles. This has further, decimated, my dear friends, the, health of economy and caused the affected areas to be unable to be developed in the most scientific and organized manner. Another example could be of, South Africa. Nelson Mandela, my dear friends, expired in 2013. You can correct me. So in the wake of, apartheid, separation of people where the minority of what we call the white Africans ruled over the majority of the black Africans could earn money, my dear friends, or favor if they were, well liked, splitting what we call even the black Africans into groups. And these what we call, separations ultimately led internal resistance, uprisings, demonstrations, fulminations, conflicts, violence, and many other important difficulties. Countries like Angola, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, the Republic of the Zimbabwe, Niger, Chad, we find the elements of what we call even in the post-apartheid period, they are still what we call, despite being decolonized, they are, having that kind of a, discrimination which was prevalent before their decolonization. If you take into account another important economic issue that is relating to the diamond trade. Diamond trade in Africa. United Nations has been trying to stop the trade of the so-called blood diamonds, which we have, witnessed. I hope you might have seen this movie, Blood Diamond, with the same name. And my dear friends, when we are, talking of, blood diamond, we are basically talking of conflict diamonds. This is another name which is generally attributed by the vernacular press, vernacular African press. In the media, you will find in Africa that kind of a, usage. Another important, process, which is popularly known as the Kimberley, process, is an international organization of, countries who are against conflict diamond trade. Because Zimbabwe had been, suspended from the organization in recent years, but had not been accused of, producing conflict diamonds. It has created a situation which we generally accost in our, backyard, and that is in Afghanistan. So far, the Afghans, what we call, opium trade is concerned. That has also what we call, having some international implications. In the same manner or similarly, it is the conflict diamond or the diamond trade in Africa, where the conflict blood diamonds are diamonds that are gathered by people who are forced to work, killed if they do not work, or do not gather enough diamonds in a single day. There is a quota, there is a demand from the, diamond trade, syndicates, and they are operating like a mafiosi. I'm not talking of the human trafficking, my dear friends. That is also, there. But it is the, diamond trade that has ultimately weakened the institutional framework for the protection of human rights. Another important area is relating to the malnutrition all over the Africa. If you take into account the latest estimates of the World Health Organization, my dear friends, you will find that the malnutrition has been playing a major role in the half of all under 5, what we call, particularly in case of children. We find under 5 deaths each year in a developing, what we call, country. Malnutrition, my dear friends, can also cause brain damage, blindness, and increased risk of infection. Moreover, parents who are, malnourished cannot provide or care for their children and are more likely to sell them as what we call laborers or even in slavery. Worldwide, my dear friends, 1 billion or more than 1 billion children live in poverty without adequate food, without adequate what we call, dignified existence that includes shelter, water, protection, healthcare, and access to education. So there is no human dignity at all. So these are some of the vital issues in the context of Africa continent. That is why I have chosen, let us debate what kind of a protection system. Here we are not talking right now the protection system, rather we are talking of human rights issues in the context of Africa. Then we would come to another important stage that is devoted what has been the institutional framework for the protection of human rights in Africa continent, and to what extent these institutional what we call frameworks have been what we call there, and to what extent these institutional frameworks have been successful. So how to measure that very threshold, that is another important dimension. But there is another important issue before I proceed further. Another important issue is relating to terrorism. Terrorism and its persons cannot be ruled out on African soil. Africa as a continental region is so poor, my dear friends, that if doesn't have the necessary resources needed to fight terrorist activities. It does not have that kind of a law enforcement mechanism which is required in a civilized, democratically embedded geopolitical entity. Many countries in Africa believe, my dear friends, that the United States of America needs to play a supporting role and not a leadership role in this particular problem. But the problem with the United States of America is, whenever United States of America offers its assistance and humanitarian aid for fighting terrorism, it also provides its own conditions, roadmap, and it also creates some financial liabilities, which are on many occasions are beyond the capacity of the developing nation states. Therefore, it is the fundamental responsibility of these developing nation states, my dear friends. And they are right when they are requesting and making a case. Support does not include the leadership tendencies. But over the years, what I have been witnessing as a student of international human rights law, after the inauguration of the Bretton Woods institutions in 1944, economic models are prepared in Washington or in New York for the global South jurisdictions since 1945, particularly after the inauguration and adoption of the Charter of the United Nations Organizations in 1945. All kinds of progress models, development models economic models, welfare of the people living in the global south jurisdictions, everything is being decided, and there happens to be decided at either at New York or at Washington. So it is the Washington based wisdom, it is the New York based wisdom, it is the London based wisdom that is being propagated, and that is suffering from some kind of a leadership tendencies. That leadership syndrome, I should call it. That leadership, syndrome is basically resented by the global South nation states. That should not be there. Because on the bilateral level or at the level of multilateralism, my dear friends, it is basically the sovereign equality that should be the guiding force, even if we are going to support a weak economy. But it is other way around. It is basically the leadership, characteristics. What we have, witnessed in case of the Gulf War first in the recent memory, my dear friends, Gulf War II, Afghanistan, and other important what we call, flashpoints. It was the leadership role. In the 21st century, and in continuation what has been there in the post-Second World War arena. So that leadership tendency should not be there. Because United States of America has provided all kinds of, logistical, support, infrastructural, what we call, supports. It has, provided to some of the, nation states in Africa to fight terrorism, some trucks, communications equipments, training courses, orientation courses, to many, armed forces, particularly in Mali. United States of America has, provided, strengthened the, Mali army. But what happened in Afghanistan? It was the NATO armed forces which ultimately brutalized with their, barbarity, so far the local people, and particularly NATO armed forces. Among the NATO armed forces, Australian and British contingents have been what we call, rampant in committing crimes against women as a part of what we call the NATO armed forces. So these contingents have committed all sorts of crimes. And I'm not saying it is the Western media, my dear friends. It is the institutional indictment on the part of the, Western investigating agencies. They have identified who were involved in the crimes against women, including the crime of rape against the Afghan women. So that leadership tendency should not be there. There is another important, dimensions. I'm sorry. Dimensions relating to diseases. Suppose, for example, malaria. All of us are, well acquainted that malaria is primarily a disease which is carried by mosquitoes. 90% of all deaths from this disease occur in sub-Saharan Africa. Malaria, my dear friends, parasites start to multiply within red blood cells, as you are well acquainted, causing symptoms that include fever, headache, and other incidental what we call, problems. In severe, cases, the disease worsens, leading to the hallucinations, delusion, coma, including what we call it can go to the extent of, death. So diseases cannot be what we call, ruled out, and they are also constitute a very, very important what we call dimension and contribute in starvation and poverty. HIV and AIDS, 2/3 of all peoples in sub-Sahara Africa, my dear friends, have either HIV or AIDS. Recently, we have also, witnessed Ebola virus. And when Ebola virus was at its, zenith, my dear friends, out of 318 what he call, cases, 288 of them what he call, died. Attacks the, walls of blood cells of causing to the bleeding, or rather I should say, Ebola virus was the most notorious in the sense that it was the cause for internal bleeding in the human body. That has also, the health infrastructure or healthcare, what we call, infrastructure is not adequately available to the people of, Africa continent. That is another important, dimensions of the violations of human rights at the level of state. Another important, dimension is of population. Population also constitute. Population is also, cause of worry in South Asia. In the context of, Africa, my dear friends, it is also gripped by one of the, greatest population explosions ever recorded. If you take into account the last, what we call, 70 years, birth rates in rest of the world's developing countries have declined by almost, 1.5. While if you take into account, Africa has, quadrupled to 1 billion, and that is the half of African, what we call, people, particularly half of the, African 15 and younger, what we call, population. Older children are, they are generally sent away to cities to fend for themselves so that their families have fewer children to feed and to house, or to provide any kind of a shelter or any kind of what you call of, necessity which is necessary to sustain their existence as a human being. And that is nothing beyond animal existence. And due to the social, what we call, pressures, my dear friends, poor healthcare and level of education has also been what we call one of the, worries. And that is why many of the, parents are sending their what we call older children who have attained the age of 15 years or above. They are generally sent to urban centers, and during their stay at the urban centers, they indulge in all kinds of, crimes. They are the potential what we call, criminals. Very few what we call, people are, employed in some kind of a dignified what we call, employment. But ultimately, whether it is the, minting money out of crime or out of what we call, labor, it is the sole responsibility of these, children. Ultimately, they have to what we call support themselves. They have to fend themselves. They have to what we call defend themselves against all kinds of, odds. Because at the urban centers, my dear friends, what kind of a life they have been spending? They generally live in slums. They do not have toilets. They have no washrooms, no clean water, no shelter. But they generally is striving for only for one thing, and that is one good meal a day. They do not have any kind of a, schooling. They do not have any kind of a, hygiene or good hygiene. 60% of the, unemployment of the parents means many children go without shoes and proper what we call, clothing. That is the state of affairs in Africa continent. Here lies the importance, my dear friends, of a, human rights protection system. Or you may call it the African human rights system. We are having, my dear friends, African Charter. My dear friends, it is one of the 4 regional human rights agreements. African Charter was primarily adopted in the year 1981. And in the subsequent years, I think in 1986, African Charter on Human and People's Rights got operational. It came into existence, and all 53 nation states or African Union countries have become the party to the African Charter. African Charter on Human and People's Rights, my dear friends, incorporates invariably all the rights, or I should say many rights and guarantees found in other international human rights agreements, instruments, and treaties are also reflected in African, what we call, charter. And if you take into account the novelty of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, my dear friends, it embodies a certain important, what we call, segments of rights, like economic, social, and cultural rights, have been given some kind of a preponderance and primacy in the entire scheme of human rights in the context of Africa. It is basically takes into account, in addition to the socio-economic rights of social rights of the people, it takes into account the new kind of novelty, and that is the people's rights. And the third stage, in terms of treatment, across the border treatment, my dear friends, that has been given to the idea of civil and political rights. But if you compare the third stage that has been accorded to civil and political rights, then it is the first stage in the Eurocentric schematization of rights in Europe, or in the Western, what we call scholarship of the Western scheme of human rights. You will find that the civil and political rights have been given at the very first pedestal, or the very first generation of human rights. But this is not the case in the African context. It is the third stage, or you may call it the third generation of human rights in African context. The first generation of human rights in the context of entire Africa continent, it is the social, economic, and cultural rights. These rights are generally clubbed with that of the first generations of human rights at a regional level in the context of Africa. So far, the second generations of human rights in African context are concerned, it is basically the rights of the people. And the third generations of human rights in the context of Africa, my dear friends, it is the civil and political rights. Now you can draw a comparison. You can understand what kind of understanding African people have been attributing to the entire human rights discourse. This is my own orientation, my dear friends. You will not find in any kind of a reference book or any kind of a book that is available on human rights. This kind of a terms, though the word generation, when I am talking of the generations of human rights, it was not the Western orientation of generations of human rights. This kind of a nomenclature came out from the mouth of a professor hailing from Senegal, and that too in the year 1977 or 75, long back, my dear friends. So generations of human rights is not a Western, what we call creativity. It is the a creativity that comes from the global, what we call South. Therefore, idea of human rights, African Charter of Human and People's Rights, my dear friends, imposes duties and obligations on states and individuals. It does not contemplate the primacy of rights. It contemplates under all circumstances, my dear friends, the idea of duties, notion of obligations, and that should be the guiding force. And it also provides the enforcement mechanisms via African Commission on Human Rights, African Court of Human Rights. So this particular point, it should never be forgotten, my dear friends, because African Charter provides some kind of a distinction, some kind of a dichotomy in the sense of what we call of implementation. Here, so far, the Eurocentric idea of human rights is concerned, it is primarily attributes highest level of significance in the availability or making available human rights, and it is basically the civil and political rights. But on the other hand, in the African context, it is the primacy that has been accorded to the economic, social, and cultural rights, and that constitute the first and foremost what I call rights. It means there is a sense of collectivism. There is a collective celebration and commemoration of human rights. There is a group corroboration of human rights in the name of collectivism, in the name of Marxism, in the name of what we call the third world approaches to international law that begins from the what we call perceiving international law from below. But whereas in the Western, what we call, scholarship, we find that it is the, individualism, liberalism. It is nothing, but it is the celebration of civil and political rights. So primacy, under all circumstances, is given to the civil and political, understandings. So this should also be, taken into consideration, because when we are, talking of in African context, my dear friends, when we are dealing with this particular idea, economic, social, and cultural rights, then we are basically taking into consideration conventional rights, traditional rights, customary rights, whatever may be the nomenclature, but we can't give a nomenclature like liberal rights or individual rights. No, it is basically the traditional rights, because these rights include right to work, right to equal pay for equal work, right to health, right to education, right to participation in the cultural life. And initially, my dear friends, if you recall my today's deliberations, how I have started making my submissions, I have identified the culture as an element, a central element when we are talking of human rights in the context of Africa. It is basically this particular core value, and that core value is culture. So it is the cultural, wisdom. It is the centrality of culture. It is the most important integral value that is celebrated as a culture. So culture is of vital importance, and under all circumstances, culture must be, taken as the guiding force that basically determines the contours of the entire human rights norms implementing or implementable in the context of Africa. And for that, we have to understand, my dear friends, apart from, in addition to culture, it is equally important to understand the history of the African Charter. How this African Charter came into existence. Because how to establish, and for establishing human rights mechanism, and that too based on the historical African unique experiences of decolonizations from the West, identification of culture as the guiding force, acknowledging the uniqueness of the African people, African orientation of human rights. Then the first of all, it has been conceived, my dear friends, in Lagos, in Nigeria, in 1961 at the Congress of African what we call jurists. For the first time, an attempt has been made, but it was not a successful attempt on the part of community of African jurists. They have not been successful. Again, they met what we call second time, and it was basically the second president of Senegal, President what we call Senghor, who ultimately put the agenda of creating regional human rights mechanism in Africa in 1979. And that too, my dear friends, again, this attempt has not been successful. Then the third president of Gambia convened the first what he called drafting and adopted ultimately the African Charter for this particular reason. African Charter is also called, my dear friends, Banjul Charter, because it has been at a place called Banjul. It was basically determined or at Banjul. That is why this particular name of the city has also been prefixed as an adjective to charter, and it is generally addressed as Banjul Charter of 28th of June 1981. And It ultimately, what you call, came into existence or came into force, you may call it, on 21st of October in 1986. So for that, I would be sharing another important, a very, very significant, contributions from different, scholars in the form of articles. Because primacy under all circumstances, so far this particular, charter is concerned, it was basically the economic, social, and cultural rights. And these, rights have been branded as the new rights. New rights which have not been covered, my dear friends, in earlier, what we call, incarnations or, incorporations of human rights or other human rights agreements. Because these economic, social, and cultural rights, my dear friends, have been new in the sense that the right to property, right to equal access to public service, right to equal access to public property and services, these were, identified. But here you may ask a question to me, and you might be thinking on these lines when I am using the word human rights and people's rights. Because it is the novelty, it is the uniqueness, my dear friends, of African, what we call, scholarship that is undertaking this particular premise. Premise of, using people's rights. What does it entail? What does it convey? How to perceive it? Is there any kind of a difference between the people's rights and human rights? Why this expression has been, what we call, used by the African scholarship in the title or in the theme of the charter, or as a head of the, charter, as the title of the charter? We do not find in the Western, what we call, titles, this kind of a, usage. So what is the difference between the people's rights and human rights? Why these two words have been used at the same time? Both the titles have been included in the head of this particular, a regional mechanism that is known as the, African Charter on Peoples and Human Rights. Are people not human? Or humans are not people? Why? How to answer this question? How to attend this question? I hope you are ready to help me to understand. This is a question that would be there in your midterm, your end-term examination. So the one question is out. So how do you perceive it? But you should not take my claim seriously that it is going to be there in the question paper for end-term examination. It is one of the possibilities. Anybody can come out. How do you perceive this idea? Let me try. Please, you have to help me. Because I'm not in the habit of claiming some kind of an expertise in the area of human rights or in the area or areas which I have been dealing with in different semesters. So I do not claim anything. I'm still in the process of learning. So let me try. Dear friends, when we are talking of people's rights, then I find an element of uniqueness in African Charter. Uniqueness in the sense that the history of Africa reflects a colonial history. At the same time, I also witness, my dear friends, some kind of a volatility or uncertainty over the semantics called peoples. When we are talking of, usage like peoples, it also alludes to the idea of right to self-determination. In the context of right to self-determination, as you have understood common article 1 to both the covenants, a right to self-determination in UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966 and UN Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights of 1966, then right to self-determination has been what we call, there. Because that primarily empowers people to freely dispose of wealth and natural resources. So the people's rights over, nature. It is the element of the permanent sovereignty over natural resources that has been recognized under international environmental law or under international climate change regime as the right of states. But in the context of Africa continent, my dear friends, people rights include their sovereignty over the natural resources. So the people's rights. It goes beyond what we call human rights. That is why in this particular convention, people's and human rights phraseology has been employed, as far as my understanding or my endeavor is concerned. Another important dimension which I would like to share with you in continuation of my understandings, what does it convey? I mean, the word peoples. Then it also, it is also relating to economic, social, and cultural rights and development. It also takes into account, my dear friends, to national and international peace and security. That is also the understanding which is generally what we call, taken by the people in this part of the world when we are, talking of African, what we call orientation of human rights. Another important, premise that should not be forgotten in the context of the, people's rights, it is basically the civil and political rights. Because when we are, talking of the civil and political rights, we are undertaking some kind of a sub-stratification relating to the enjoyment of these, civil and political rights. Because civil and political rights can only be enjoyed, my dear friends, if there is no discrimination. So freedom from discrimination also constitutes the element of the, peoples that has been used in the context of, Africa nomenclature or African nomenclature while heading or entitling this, regional arrangement for the protection of human rights as African Charter of Peoples and Human Rights. Because when we are, talking of freedom from discrimination, we are talking of, my dear friends, there should not be any kind of a racial discrimination. There should not be any kind of a, ethnic, discrimination, or the communitarian discrimination, or the collective discrimination, or the discrimination should not be there in the form of a collective, what we call, punishment. A discrimination should not be based on sex, language, political opinion, or other, what we call, opinion, or any kind of a, social origin, or on the basis of, religion, nationality, or national, what we call, origins, or some kind of a, fortune, or on the basis of, descent, or on the basis of, birth, or other important human status. Discrimination encompasses, my dear friends, a vital, what we call, dimension. Because of discrimination, not only in situations of the collective rights, but the discrimination in terms of what we call of, Western orientation of, human rights. Discrimination is always present. So in the context of, people's rights, discrimination must not be, there. So it is the fundamental responsibility of the state apparatus that in case of, Africa or African understanding of human rights, discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sex, religion, political opinion, social what we call origins, or any other status. It should not have been there, because discrimination or non-discrimination particularly demands that there is a idea of equality before the law, equal protection of the law, and freedom of association, freedom of what we call of assembly, freedom of practice of any sort of what we call of religion, freedom what we call public participation in the governmental affairs and other and there should not be, my dear friends, state must not indulge in any kind of a refoulement or the mass expulsions and slavery what we call. So this should be always be prohibited, and all the 9 core international human rights treaties and the obligations there under which have been contemplated must also be what we call protected. So that is the beauty of this particular term called peoples and human rights, because it is very, very important. You can take even the separate what we call rights, like a right to fair trial. For example, it is one of the biggest challenges at international level. Today, right to fair trial guarantee, my dear friends, constitute the most important challenge before the entire international human rights law scholarship. How to ensure fair trial guarantee as a human right? How to achieve, how to ensure. And you are mature enough, my dear friends. It does not take to understand it. It does not require the matrix of what we call of some kind of a rocket science. No, it is as simple as that. We can understand what are the fundamental principles of the natural justice. What are the fundamental fragmentation of the due process of law before convicting or before establishing the culpability of an individual? That must also be taken care of. And it is basically whether there has to be some kind of a decision or adjudication or trial before a court of law, or there happens to be some kind of a administrative inquiry, or some kind of a departmental what you call determination of guilt or fixity of responsibility. Fair trial or the fairness, fair play, that is the prerequisite of the institutional behavior, civilizational behavior, and the behavior of the state must also take into account that the right to fair trial guarantee or the fair trial is one of the most important inalienable part of what we call of the human rights corpus. Because when we are talking of the right to fair trial, there is a presumption, and the presumption about innocence. It means innocence is presumed. There is a another important element when we are talking of the fair trial. There is a element of defense. Defense is present, and that defense is always represented by a legal aid or a counsel or as an advocate. In the absence of an advocate, in the absence of any kind of a legal aid, that it is the responsibility to achieve the grand vision of right to fair trial guarantee. It is the responsibility, my dear friends, of the judicial establishment to provide some kind of a legal aid. That is generally known as the amicus curiae. So, friend of the court, that is the translation. So amicus curiae services must also be provided to ensure the realization and accomplishment of this kind of a right to fair trial guarantee. And at the same time, my dear friends, there has to be a reasonable time span or the time frame within which this right must be what we call realized by impartial court proceedings or judicial what we call commission or the judicial tribunal. So that is the beauty of the right to fair trial guarantee, and it is one of the most important what we call element of this grand vision that has been nomenclatured, embedded in this particular regional arrangement for the protection of human rights, known as African System of Human Rights. Another important, dimension to it. The retroactive application of the criminal law under all circumstances should never be pursued. As I have already told you, there should not be any kind of a collective punishment. Right may be limited by law. Right may be limited by applying the rule of law, not by rule by law. So there has to be an express, what we call, opinions, associations, assembly, movement, residence, and there should not be no reservation or temporary suspensions of anything. That is these are the, structural requirements, basic structural, fundamental, what we call, requirements. And it is one of the most important, what we call, part of the basic structure of international law, particularly international human rights law. So this is how we should try to understand this whole idea of, of human rights in the context of what we call of, Africa. Another important dimensions that is relating to some other important, arrangements, like, emergence of the, African Union, African Court of Human Rights, African Commission on Human Rights. These are some of the, other important, facets. Definitely, I am going to provide you some of the important, dimensions to it in the form of, articles, in the form of, some other arrangements, and some important, what we call, collection of material, very few from your examination point of view, because this is the, notion so far, the African system of human rights, and this is the, premise where from you are going to face a lot of what we call, questions in your end-term examinations. With these, few submissions, I take your leave to leave, because this is the, this was the, promise which I have made, that I would be conducting 1.5 hours, deliberations on this particular, aspect. So whenever the, next occasion arises, I would be inviting in the next week with a new, what we call, dimension of human rights, and we will continue our, intellectual peregrination for that. I'm immensely thankful to you. So thank you very much for the evening. Thanks a lot. And I'm equally thankful to all of you to share your valuable time in this engagement. So thank you very much. Now,
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Floor is open.
So,
You can put forward.
Thank you, sir.
You can also email me whatever you want to say. So thank you very much. For
Thank you, sir.
thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you, sir.
Bye. Thank you.